All right, good morning. Welcome everyone to another Ironside Take30. This time we're focusing on BI and specifically IBM Cognos licensing compliance. So I'm joined today by Tim Kraytek, our CEO. And after we do some introductions, we're going to go through a discussion about software compliance, walk through the different types of licensing available, and then talk about best practices for staying compliant with IBM software licensing as it pertains to Cognos. Go ahead, Tim. All right, so I'll allow Tim to introduce himself.
Thanks, Scott, appreciate it. Tim Kraytek, I'm the founder and CEO at Ironside. I've been working with Cognos Technologies for about 25 years. So lots of history of the process there, and happy to spend some time talking about our experience and our clients' experience in this area.
And my name is Scott Masage. I'm the practice director for BI at Ironside, and been with Ironside almost 9 years now, but in the Cognos ecosystem for about 21 years.
That's great. So Scott, thank you, and I look forward to some questions. Here, maybe you want to go through this?
Sure. So in terms of upcoming events, so today is obviously focused on Cognos license compliance. Next week, we are focused on IBM Guardium for data protection. Following that, accelerating advanced analytics for banking, driven by our data science team. And then finally, the last session in May, focusing on data strategy, the benefit of planning and developing a data roadmap, hosted by Paul Hardy.
Excellent. So jumping into the topic at hand. So why are we discussing software compliance? All of you have or likely have relationships with software companies like IBM, where you purchase access to use software, and you know, a lot of the content that we discuss, you know, on these sessions is how to more effectively leverage these technologies to improve your business. As we know, selling software and software licensing is a business, and many vendors like IBM have a process within which they validate and verify that you're using their software correctly. What is IBM's expectation perspective? Essentially, IBM will license you software, and they expect you to use it per the terms of their license agreements. At a high level, IBM Passport Advantage is the structure within which most of IBM software is sold. And you know, the audit rights of IBM exist there and are you know, pretty clearly spelled out in hundreds of pages of legalese. So from our standpoint, I think, you know, our goal here is to give you some tips and tricks and thoughts around how to think about this, not just when you get the phone call that you are being audited. It's something that we recommend that is part of your standard practice. Many companies have a software asset management practice and role. I think that there are some aspects of the way that IBM licenses software, and a lot of the conversation is more broad than Cognos, but we are going to focus on Cognos because there is some complexity to that as well. What is the risk to the business of non-compliance? The risk to the business of non-compliance is actually a financial risk. So if you're not, I mean, there's probably a legal risk, but at the end of the day, what we see is if IBM does audit you and they determine that you are using the software inappropriately, they will actually charge you you know, in a lot of cases, a fairly sizable amount of money for that non-compliance. One of the key things, and again, if you've been involved in software deals or software transactions with IBM, you know, there's often negotiation around, you know, what is the list price and, you know, what is the discounted price. When you've gone through an audit and, you know, for instance, let's say that, you're licensed for 100 users, and they determine that you are using 200 users. In their opinion, they will actually charge you list price for those 100 users, and that can get pretty expensive pretty quickly. So our recommendation is to think about and be proactive in managing access to software, managing, sort of the process, and, we'll talk about some use cases in a little bit, or some examples that we've seen, but, this can add up pretty quickly. We've seen customers with multi-million-dollar compliance assessments from IBM, and, clearly that once you start talking about millions of dollars, it does get people's attention, but this is often something people are passive about, or customers are passive about. If you do get that lucky phone call, and you are chosen, or you win an audit, just like you would with someone like the IRS, you're expected to provide information. IBM's ILMT program is a technology that IBM provides for free, and if any of your licensing is done on a CPU or a PVU basis, IBM expects you to run this software. Our experience is that most companies, or many companies, do not run this software, and this becomes a problem when the request for reporting happens. So essentially, ILMT is a utility that runs within your business or on your cloud architectures, essentially keeping track of how much of the technology you're using and what host you're using it on. In this particular case, this is IBM's view of what to do when you're selected for a software audit, and that is essentially press a button, run a report, send it to IBM. Again, that is what IBM documents and communicates. From our standpoint, it's often a much more labor-intensive process. Usually ILMT is not in place. So, this is something we'll talk a little bit about. So, taking a step back, when you think about licensing within the IBM world, there are there are many examples of the way IBM licenses, but in general, it's either a hardware-based license or a user-related metric license. In the Cognos world, the most common examples are PVU-based licensing. PVU essentially equals CPU. IBM takes it a step further, and they actually evaluate the speed of the CPU. The link that I have on the slide here is actually how to determine what the PVU value is for the actual processes that you're running the technology on. Generally speaking, a CPU is either 70 or 100 PVUs, depending upon the speed and the sophistication. Again, this is typically evaluated when you are acquiring software or expanding usage. This is probably the most problematic area that we see. And there's also a concept of subcapacity, which we'll talk about in a little bit. This is sort of one of the areas where we see the most challenges, both from an understanding perspective as well as from an audit yielding a settlement or yielding a compliance issue. RVU is a metric that comes into play in specific licensing arrangements. IBM had a licensing bundle called PCI, which was Predictive Customer Intelligence. We definitely implemented that package of licensing at a number of different customers. RVU is this predictive and customer intelligence was a single view, a customer view. One RVU would give you access to 100,000 customers. So it's a little bit of a different metric. And again, if you have RVU pricing, we're certainly happy to dig into it and help you with that. But in general, again, these are often thought about and discussed at the outset when licenses are purchased. with transitions of resources and time, often those details get sort of lost. So they do get resurrected in an audit. So we do recommend having a pretty good sense of how you're licensed for the technologies that you are using. User-related metrics are a little bit more straightforward. Authorized users in the Cognos world today, you're going to see Cognos User, Cognos Explorer, Cognos Administrator. We will discuss sort of the evolution of Cognos licensing. There are definitely, over the last 10 or 12 years, there's been a significant simplification of licenses. That being said, your POE and your entitlements in your contract with IBM may be at a lower level of granularity, meaning you may see old license types on your contracts. And again, if there's any questions, I know some of the folks out there have been Cognos customers for 10, 15 years, and very likely you bought things like Cognos User or Cognos Professional, which don't map directly to the way that things are licensed today. Floating user, concurrent user, I can have 100 users on a box at any given time. If I ever have more than that, then I'm out of compliance. A little bit more complex. I don't think they tend to license Cognos in that way. There are definitely concurrent licenses for SPSS, and then there may be some very small cases of simultaneous session licensing as well. So the Cognos Analytics feature matrix, this is actually the current view of it. The licensing that IBM sells today is either going to be in one of these 4 columns: viewer, user, explorer, administrator. You'll see that administrator is really necessary for managing the portal environment and the SDK. In a lot of cases, and we'll kind of look at some of the historical views, in a bit, but they've done a nice job of simplifying it. But again, your Passport Advantage may show different names, and as such, sometimes it's difficult to map them. And again, we're happy to help you to do that. Cognos Viewer tends to be, this was called a distribution license, information distribution license not that long ago. This is someone that's interacting but not answering prompts, so they can see content. They can have content delivered to them, but they can't, as you'll see here, execute reports and respond to prompt reports. So if I want to send a PDF to somebody, a viewer is okay. If I want them to answer a prompt in a report, then I need to have a user license for them. Cognos Explorer gets into Framework Manager, Transformer, Cube Designer, PAX, which is the Excel plugin, and the Jupyter Notebooks is related to data science and predictive analytics. So most capabilities within Cognos now fit within this user column, and that's I think that simplification is good. That being said, as I mentioned, if we go back to 2018, analytics information distribution, user, explorer, administrator, and forward-looking analytics architect. So there are a number of different licenses, and they have slightly different sets of capabilities. These capabilities are mapped inside of the Cognos portal, and I think that usually we see those licenses and capabilities mapped into things like Active Directory groups, which allow operational teams to sort of secure and allocate licensing from a user perspective. So again, not going to spend a lot more time on this. And if we go all the way back to 2010, you have enhanced consumer, advanced business author, professional author. So some of you may see, SNS reports with 1,000 enhanced consumers and not really know how to map that to user. So we're happy to kind of help you with that process, and if necessary, help you upgrade the licenses to the current view. But this has changed quite a bit, and that makes things confusing. So that's part of the reason why we're having this dialogue. So common issues. So we're going to talk a little bit about issues that we see with our customers. So this full capacity versus subcapacity. Really what this means is that prior to the cloud, most of our customers would deploy on virtual machines on either VMware or ESX hosts. Let's just say I have a machine that has 50 CPUs in it, and then I have, a whole bunch of VMs that sit on top of that. I may have PVU licensing for a 4 CPU capacity of Cognos that's sitting in a VM that is limited to a certain set of memory in those 4 CPUs. If I'm on a single machine that's a 4 CPU machine with memory, that's considered full capacity of the machine. If I'm on a machine with 50 CPUs and I allocate 4 to just the Cognos application instance, that's considered subcapacity. So I'm using a small capacity of the machine, a smaller capacity than the full machine to allocate. In this situation, this is the #1 area where we see issues around compliance. You 100% have to run ILMT. If you cannot prove to IBM that you have limited access in that VM to 4 CPUs, then you are going to run into an issue where they will give you a very, very large compliance issue, because you're going to have, in that scenario I gave you, 50 CPUs on the machine. You're only using and allocating 4. You're only licensed for 4. That means that you're 46 CPUs out of compliance. That number is going to have that's going to be in the millions of dollars of issue, right? You may have a Cognos application that you spend $400,000 or $500,000 on. You pay $100,000 of maintenance. When you get a $10 million license settlement bill, it's going to be very eye-opening. So to me, this is something that a lot of people don't understand, and it's something that I think you 100% need to pay attention to. We install ILMT at all of our managed service customers, and we recommend that all of our customers run it, just because it's your best defense mechanism against a very large settlement bill. Misassignment, misunderstanding of license capabilities. I've given you an example of sort of how complex the licensing is. We'll talk about it in a little bit, but this is an area where oftentimes we will see someone licensed for 4 admin licenses and 200 user licenses, or 10 admin licenses and 2,000 user licenses, and it turns out that all 2,000 users have capability that's tied to an admin. Again, this is a situation where you could definitely end up with a big compliance issue. Licensing of external users. So when I say external users, I mean consultants. I mean, we have customers that are in the insurance space. They have agencies that sell their products that are not, badged and licenses under the parent company. There's complexity to that. That's often an issue. We do see people trying to work around the licensing arrangements, right? And in a lot of cases, this is my view is these decisions are often made by people that don't understand the liability that's built into these contracts on purpose. And I think that if we see this, we recommend that it be stopped and corrected. And again, I think there's a lack of understanding about the complexity we just talked about related to what capabilities go with what license. So in a lot of cases, people will say, hey, I didn't know, or it changed. Unfortunately, it is your responsibility to know your licensing agreement, what you're paying for and what you're not allowed to do. This next one, unwitting assignment of capabilities by ITOps. Again, our recommendation in a lot of cases is to not manage users inside of Cognos portal. Our recommendation is to manage, to basically map to AD or sort of centralized security groupings, and then you add and take away people from those groupings, so that the typical IT ops process to add someone to access interactive reports or to access other capabilities. We see some challenges here if there's not good change management around the process, or there's not good approvals. We've seen a lot of situations where everyone is given access to Cognos in an organization that isn't licensed for everyone, and that's a problem. There are some challenges where users are deleted from AD because they were either mistakenly added. In some cases, they will then show up in logs inside of Cognos. Deleting users from Cognos is another issue that has some, there'll often be artifacts left that create entries in logs that will show up in audit that you wouldn't know about. And this last one is if user is erroneously assigned. If someone was brought into a group temporarily and erroneously and then taken out later, they may show up as an active user when IBM or IBM's partners come in to audit. So these are some areas where we see problems, and as such, we think that having more focus on this is a good thing. So in Cognos 11, IBM introduced a dashboard around sort of ownership and which sort of capability is being used, and we've identified some issues with this, and it seems to be a very simple view of the problem that I've just described. Scott, maybe you want to kind of share your observation of that?
Sure, absolutely. So, as Tim said, right, this was introduced in the 11.0.x era, and shows you something that you would have to dig around, do a lot of manual effort to find otherwise. And this is actually central to the audit process when you have named users in the 11.x era. This is, in terms of how this works, this interface is driven by a table in the content store that tracks users based on their capabilities and their last login date. And that last part about the login date is critical because what is shown here doesn't automatically update. Should you find a user that is incorrectly assigned to a capability and you correct it, this interface is not going to update until that person logs in again, right? So again, they actually need to log in for this to reflect that change. Now, normally this isn't an issue with an active user community. However, there are certain situations that are problematic, as you might imagine. So, for example, if you've got a user who is incorrectly assigned rights that logs in one time and never again, they show up here showing, they show in the wrong role, right? In the wrong license role. So, in a situation where that user in the organization is then, let's say they've left the organization, right? If the folks managing your LDAP instance that secures the authentication source that secures Cognos, if they remove the user, then what has to happen is you run the content store consistency checker that updates everything, and then things should be fine. However, not every organization does that, right? Some organization, given that the centralized authentication provider is integrated in all of the applications and systems in an organization, what is typically done is that the users are simply disabled. And in our research, we found that disabling that user sort of isn't good enough for this tool. It isn't a flag that this tool considers to remove them or move them around into a different role. So there are some certain situations where again the approach this tool takes is problematic, but again, this is the basis of named user audits from IBM.
Excellent, thanks, Scott. Appreciate that insight, and definitely it's a useful tool, but there are some challenges with it. So I think notionally it is useful and gives you what you need, but there's another layer of detail behind it. So when you think about best practices here, what do we recommend? So the first thing is really truly understanding what you're licensed for. So that would be looking at your Passport Advantage and your POE, which is your proof of entitlement. You can get that at the link I have here, ibm.com software Passport Advantage. You do need to go through, I think, your primary technical contact to get access to this, but it would be, if you're charged with managing your Cognos environment, I would say that it would be good for you to have this clearly laid out again, we're happy to help you to interpret it. And if you are on legacy licenses, happy to help you sort of map them to the current thing. I would say don't make assumptions. Don't make the assumption that it's all set and someone looked at it and you have no issues. I would, you know, if I'm in your seat, I want to make sure that I'm not running afoul of my licensing agreement with IBM, because you will get a bill, and right, you know, sometimes that bill is very, very large, and you know that makes people upset when you have unexpected financial obligations that you can't defend because you didn't do the homework. Understand what functionality is tied to what license. Again, we sort of laid that out at a high level. You know, our recommendation is to perform a self-audit around both Cognos and TM1 and SPSS licensing, but also really all of IBM licensing at least once a year. What we see as a best practice is to do that ahead of your SNS renewal if you're on perpetual licenses. Highly recommended. Again, we do it with all of our managed service customers. We advocate it wherever we can. So please take that advice. If you license software on a PVU or a VPC or a CPU basis, make sure you're running ILMT. If nothing, it's going to make the process go quicker. But if you pair ILMT with a self-audit, you know, you can feel pretty good that you're not going to run into issues. Again, don't look the other way. Don't assume that this is not an issue. I would actually take the opposite approach. I would look at it and say, you know, this is likely an issue for you. It just hasn't shown up yet. We see very few audits that end up with no cost or no payment. And you know, I would say, you know, you think about the IRS and an audit there. Their job is to perform an audit to get a financial outcome. It's not to just prove that everything's going well, despite what they tell you. All right, we've got a few more minutes for questions here. Scott, I don't know if you have any that have come in via chat. If anybody has questions, please use the chat mechanism. Happy to answer. Also happy to follow up, here to help if there are questions or there are complexities. You know, there's a lot of stuff in the Cognos family. It's not just User Explorer. You know, there's Cognos Controller, Cognos TM1, Cognos SPSS, and each of them have their own complexities from a licensing perspective. So we're happy to help you get comfortable with what your license obligations are and how do you make sure that you stay compliant.
Okay, thank you, Tim. So we do have one question. Let's see. That's a good one. Okay, so how does IBM pick the companies they want to audit?
You know, that's a really good question. I think that there is a process where anyone at IBM has the ability to either request or suggest an audit. There's a random cycle. I would say if you've been not audited in the last 3 years, you know, it tends to be every 3 to 4 years is what the schedule of audits are, and that's random. And then also if there's a reason or someone in the ecosystem, whether it's a partner, whether it's an IBM, or whether it's a support person, feels that there's either a lack of understanding of the licensing metrics and process, or you know, there's maybe calls made for support on either unsupported products or unsupported capabilities. I think that may also trigger audits. You know, at the end of the day, you often don't know what causes the trigger for an audit, because and they'll often just tell you that it's a random audit, and that's sort of what they lead with in most conversations. Again, I think you have to take the approach that, you know, you are expected to follow the licensing agreement. Unfortunately, the licensing agreements are complicated, and you will be audited. So that would be the mantra I would go forward with.
Okay, thank you, Tim. And one other question, and it's actually one that we hear a lot when we are interacting with clients, and I think Tim touched on it a little bit, but Question is, what if I have a schedule that runs a report and then sends that report output to a list of recipients via email, right? Do those recipients need to be licensed? And yeah, and so we are often asked questions, and often it's interesting. Often there are resources at clients that are trying to kind of think around this licensing, right? And what if it's sent to a distribution list versus individuals and things of that nature? And bottom line, the definition of that information distribution license, what it used to be called and now Cognos Viewer, is, look, if a report is received by an individual through an automated process based in Cognos, they indeed need to have a Cognos Viewer or information distribution license, right? So again, and I think Tim made a great point, and that is that sometimes there are folks who are not, folks who are kind of looking for ways to address this and are not cognizant of the financial risk to their organization. And so it's very important to understand, certainly sometimes there's a desire to kind of overthink how to not have a license, but at the end of the day, it's if you will, it's a violation of the letter of law and certainly the spirit. So, okay, that appears to be the last question. So thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you, Tim, for walking us through this topic. And we look forward to having you join us next Thursday. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Scott. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for your time. Bye now.